In my program yesterday, I mentioned that there were reports, rumors about the United States and Israel being braced for a counterattack by Iran in retaliation for the Iranian attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. And there were some reports that the United States and Iran have been in contact with each other, that the United States has given assurances to Iran that it was not involved or given prior information about the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate, and that the Iranians, for their part, had told the United States to stay out of the way in case Iran does decide to launch a strike at Israel. And there was even a report yesterday, which, by the way, I don't believe, that the United States assured Iran that if there was a major attack by Iran against Israel, the United States would not be involved. It would not come to Israel's defense. I don't believe that report, by the way. I don't believe that the Iranians would have sought such assurance from the United States, and I don't believe that the United States would have given such an assurance, whatever it is that the United States might be saying that it might do. Anyway, those were the reports yesterday. Today, there have been no reports of an Iranian attack on any Israeli position. Instead, yesterday, there was a report that an Iranian official said that Iran will retaliate against Israel, but at a time and a place of its own choosing. Now, that may mean that the Iranians are biding their time and will wait for the most opportune moment to strike at Israel, or it may be an attempt to throw the dust into people's eyes in Jerusalem and Washington. But for the moment, at least, there's been no attack. I suspect that the Iranians have been advised by their various allies and friends, the Russians, the Chinese, perhaps even the Saudis, that an attack on Israel is not a good idea. That is probably exactly what Prime Minister Netanyahu wants Iran at this particular moment in time to do, and that the Iranians, who are extremely well-informed people, probably anyway understand that themselves. We'll see what happens, but for the moment at least, there has been no attack. The one thing I would say is that the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus was followed about 2 days later by a most unusual event in Ecuador, which is that the Ecuadorian security agencies stormed the Mexican embassy in Quito, the Ecuadorian capital, in order to seize Ecuador's former vice president, a friend of the former Ecuadorian president, Rafael Correa. This former vice president is apparently wanted by the current Ecuadorian authorities on all sorts of charges. I'm not going to discuss the details of those. He'd fled to the embassy seeking asylum. He'd been granted asylum by the Mexican authorities, and Ecuador responded by simply storming the embassy and seizing this former vice president. Now, this is an astonishing act. It's gone again almost entirely unreported in the international media. There seems to be almost no interest in it, which I find incredible. It is a grotesque, extreme violation of the diplomatic status of Mexico's embassy. Mexico has retaliated by closing diplomatic relations with Ecuador, and there is now a major row underway between these two countries. Nicaragua has done the same. Apparently, across Latin America, this action has been condemned. I cannot believe that the Ecuadorian authorities would not have acted in this way had they not consulted in advance with the United States. And to me, what this episode perhaps shows is the extreme extent to which the Ecuadorian political and business establishment, presumably backed by some people in the United States, is going to eliminate any residual influence of Rafael Correa in that country. Former President Correa is essentially in exile. He's not able to return to Ecuador. He clearly still has a great deal of support amongst his people. There have been elections, 2 sets of elections in Ecuador, both of which have been won by opponents of President Correa. I'm going to say straight away that there have been aspects of those elections which seem to me extremely strange. Candidates who didn't look like they would win suddenly appearing to win, new candidates appearing who seem to be intended primarily to block or to take away support from candidates who stand for President Correa's line. Anyway, I'm not going to explore all of this. I'm not an expert on Ecuadorian politics. But that an extreme step like this, violating an embassy, should be taken, and the fact that it has received no international criticism, at least from the Western powers, that, to my mind, makes it fairly clear that this is an action that was discussed and approved by the United States and probably by the other Western powers, and that, again, it highlights the extremes to which both the Ecuadorian establishment and some people in the West are going to make sure that there is no return of President Correa or of anyone who supports and approves of his political line, no return by them to power in Ecuador. Why Ecuador is seen as so important as to go to these lengths is an entirely different matter that I'm not going to explore in this program. Anyway, no attack to repeat by the Iranians so far. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Let's now turn to that other war, the war in Ukraine, war which Russia is winning and Ukraine is losing, and where actually there's been quite a lot of important news on the battlegrounds. And the first thing to say is that yesterday I mentioned that there'd been a big missile strike by the Russians against Ukraine. And the Russian Defense Ministry has now provided us with a report about it. It says that last night, this is a report that came out yesterday, last night the armed forces of the Russian Federation carried out a group strike with long-range maritime and airborne precision weapons and strike drones against military-industrial facilities engaged in the production and repair of armoured and motor vehicles, drones, military airfields, and temporary deployment areas for foreign mercenaries of the Ukrainian armed forces. The goal of the strike has been achieved. All the assigned targets have been engaged. And that's, again, all that the Russian Defense Ministry tells us. We're not provided with an exact rundown by Ukraine, or from anybody actually, as to the scale of this strike. It appears to have been a big one, but the fact is that these strikes seem to be becoming routine. One thing that does appear in the Russian Defense Ministry reports, but not as part of this account of this strike, is this comment. Operational tactical aviation, missile troops, and artillery of the Russian ground group of forces have engaged 2 launchers of French-Italian-made SAMP-T air defense system, as well as Ukrainian manpower and hardware in 133 areas during the day. Now note that this report doesn't actually claim that those 2 SAMP-T air defense systems were destroyed, but perhaps they were. But anyway, it does look as if there was a very, very significant attack this time on Ukrainian manpower and hardware, and as well as the usual attacks on air bases, depots, factories engaged in military production, that sort of thing. I get the sense that yesterday's attack, or rather the attack of the night before yesterday, that attack was principally focused on attacking positions of the Ukrainian army. And we're told that 133 areas were engaged, and that artillery, missile troops and artillery also participated, which suggests that Iskander-M surface-to-surface missiles were part of the strike. Anyway, an interesting operation taking place apparently right across the battlefronts. The Russians now able apparently to divert some of their missile forces to attack Ukrainian military positions, as well as infrastructure. So that was the story of the missile strike. We have become so accustomed to these Russian missile strikes that they're now becoming almost routine, and unless there's something dramatic happens over the course of them, I think people just report them now and move on to the next topic. I don't think we should do so. It's become increasingly clear to me that the Russians have wrested complete control of the air over Ukraine, and that they're carrying out attacks right across Ukraine. They're targeting infrastructure, roads, the energy system, but they're also now, as we see, striking at deployment points and even military units of the Ukrainian army. Now, all of this has taken place in conjunction with much news from the battlefronts. And the big news, again, is from the Bakhmut area, from Chasiv Yar, and there's now a cascade of reports, all of which seem to be telling us essentially the same thing. The first is that the Russians have now taken control of most, if not all, of the village of Bogdanovka, northeast of Chasiv Yar. There are suggestions that the Ukrainians have actually withdrawn from this village and have taken positions on the high ground to the northwest of this village, which is possible. But anyway, it does look as if the long battle for Bogdanovka has now ended. It also seems to be the case that the Russians are gradually advancing from the west, towards the west, from Ivanivska, this is south of Chasiv Yar, that they're pushing against Ukrainian defenses in the area between the Chasiv Yar Canal and Ivanivska. In other words, they're advancing across the fields and they're pushing towards the canal. But the main battle, or at least the most dramatic news, is from Chasiv Yar itself, or at least from the micro-district east of the canal. And there are now lots of reports that the Russians have entered, are now fully established inside the micro-district. There was a claim yesterday that the Russians control at least one of the big apartment buildings on the south east part of the micro-district, but that the main advance is in the north, that the Russians have occupied most of the area made up of small cottages and such buildings that lies to the northeast of Chasiv Yar, or at least of the micro-district, and that they're advancing along the railway lines towards a railway junction somewhat to the northwest of the micro-district. And several reports claim that this is the main axis of the Russian advance. If the Russians manage to capture this railway junction, then in effect the Ukrainian forces in the micro-district are cut off. Well, those are reports. As I said, they're not yet claims. We'll see what happens. There are lots of reports from all sorts of Russian forces, sources, that the Russians now have what they call fire dominance over the micro-district, that they're able to shell and launch drone attacks and bomb Ukrainian troops trying to reach the micro-district from the main part of Chasiv Yar across the canal. There are also lots of reports that they are heavily bombing Ukrainian positions within Chasiv Yar itself. And I've seen claims from Russian officials, I think to be precise from Yan Gagin, who is Pushilin's advisor, Denis Pushilin being the head of the Donetsk regional government, the Russian-appointed Donetsk regional government. Well, actually, he's elected now. Anyway, I believe it was from Yan Gagin saying that the Ukrainians have heavily fortified the central part of the micro-district, that all the buildings there are in effect fortresses, that the Ukrainians have stocked huge amounts of ammunition in the basements of these big residential buildings, and that they are intending to hold out and resist in this location. Well, all of that may be true. We shall see. Now, General Syrskyi, for his part, the Ukrainian newly appointed Ukrainian military commander, he's actually made a statement yesterday, flat out denying that the Russians had entered Chasiv Yar, any part of Chasiv Yar. I think that the accumulation of reports that say the opposite are too strong to disregard. I think that these claims by the Russians are likely true, and we should hear what Syrskyi says. Syrskyi, however, did also say other things. He said that the Ukrainian forces are short of ammunition. I'll come to that later in this program. And that they're short of men, and that they're very hard-pressed. And they're so hard-pressed, in fact, that they might be forced to fall back in a number of places. Now, this is certainly true, but I would say that it actually contradicts comments that General Syrskyi himself made some days ago. At that time, he was saying that the Ukrainians had stabilized the front lines, that they'd been able to stop the Russians advancing, that the Ukrainians were in fact counterattacking and were actually recovering ground, and that they'd captured more ground from the Russians over the last couple of weeks than they'd actually lost. I remember discussing this rather extraordinary interview that Syrskyi gave. As I said, I think it was last week in a program on this channel. Well, as I said yesterday, he said things that were rather different, that the Ukrainians are short of men and artillery, or rather, and shells, that they're suffering from an ammunition shortage, and the result is that the Russians are advancing. Well, there we go. I would say this, the Ukrainians make many claims, and I still find it strange that people are so often willing to accept their claims without perhaps the levels of corroboration that one might expect. So yesterday and the day before, there were lots of reports about a massive combined drone strike by Ukraine against multiple Russian airfields across the territory of Russia, airfields in Krasnodar, near Rostov, the Engels air base had all apparently been attacked. Claims were being made that 6 Russian aircraft had been destroyed, and those claims were increased to 19 aircraft. Several of these were said to be Tupolev F-95 strategic bombers. Well, satellite data then started to appear, and even the Institute for the Study of War in Washington came out and conceded that they couldn't corroborate that any Russian aircraft had been damaged in this drone strike at all. So there we go. People have also, as I discussed extensively yesterday, taken Ukrainian claims about destroying Russian refineries very seriously. I would remind people that the Ukrainians some weeks ago were claiming that they were shooting down large numbers of Russian aircraft. We don't hear reports of that nature for some time now. But anyway, that's what they were saying, that they shot down 2 A-50s, a score of Sukhoi 35 and Sukhoi 34 aircraft. There was no visual confirmation or corroboration for any of these claims. They've also made claims for which there is some visual corroboration, that they've destroyed Russian ships. One Russian ship, the Ivan Kotov patrol ship, has undoubtedly been destroyed. I think there's a question mark over some of the other claims. And to come back to other Ukrainian claims, yesterday, lots of claims by the Ukrainians that they completely destroyed a Russian armored advance towards the village of Terny. Lots of pictures of tanks and things, Russian tanks, rolling across the fields or the roads towards Terny, engaged by drones, supposedly up to 30 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed. There is some visual corroboration for this claim. It's likely that an attack like that did take place and that there was a convoy and that it was engaged and that some armored vehicles were destroyed. But then a couple of days ago, about last week, the Ukrainians were making similar claims about the destruction of a Russian armored advance west of Tonenka, and these claims have been repeated right across the media in the West. And as I pointed out, in reality, the claim that the armored advance was repelled turned out to be untrue, because it became clear over the course of the next couple of days that the Russians had actually captured pretty much all the ground that they were seeking to capture with this armored advance west of Tonenka. I again want to say this, it's not impossible, in fact it's highly likely, that some of these Ukrainian claims that one hears from time to time are true. Maybe, as I said, in the case of the attack on Terny, there does seem to be some visual confirmation of it. But the Ukrainians tell so many things that are refuted later that until and unless one gets full, accurate corroboration from a multiplicity of sources. It's very unwise to take these claims seriously. And coming back to what Syrskyi has been saying about Chasiv Yar, I think that there is just too much background noise about the Russian advance into Chasiv Yar at this point to doubt its essential truth. It doesn't mean that the battle for the micro-district is ended. It doesn't mean that the battle for the micro-district is close to being won by the Russians. It just means we have to be very careful about what people like Syrskyi say. Anyway, moving on, because the fighting isn't just in Chasiv Yar. It's also increasingly clear now that the Russians are continuing their advance in the Avdiivka area. And yesterday, there were reports that the Russians had destroyed a bridge across the Duran River in Umanska. This is the village west of Orlovka and Toninka on the Duran River that the Russians have reached, and that there's clearly some kind of a battle going on. It seems that the forces, the Ukrainian forces, are now in effect divided from each other in this village. I don't know the full significance of that, but anyway, fighting there is going on, and it is apparently very intense. And there is also supposedly fighting going on in other places, and there is now apparently conclusive evidence that following the capture of Vodyane, the northern part of Pervomaisky, that the Russians have been advancing south through from the north of Pervomaisky, that the area that the Ukrainians still cling on to in Pervomaisky has been reduced to a few buildings, and it's likely that the Ukrainians will be pushed out of Pervomaisky itself before long. I'm going to return to the situation around Pervomaisky shortly. This morning, we've also got further news about the situation in the two northern villages, Semyonovka and Berdichi. And there are, again, reports that the Russians now control around 2/3 of Semyonovka. Now, these are not confirmed claims, and I have to say there are other reports that tend to contradict that say that the Ukrainians still control the greater part of Semyonovka. But there are other claims, which, by the way, I think probably are correct, that the Russians now have finally pushed the Ukrainians fully out of Berdichi. It's been confirmed that the Russians control the southern, eastern, and central parts of Berdichi. This has been apparently established conclusively on the basis of film and photographic evidence over the last few days. The Ukrainians again were clinging on to some buildings in the northwest of Berdichi. Well, the reports that are coming in this morning suggest that the Russians have now finally cleared the Ukrainians out of these buildings as well, and that Berdichi finally, after intense battles, and by the way, a claim that the Russians had captured it made all the way back in October, that the Russians have finally captured this village. So, intense fighting going on in the Avdiivka area. Not clear what the Russian objectives are, whether they intend to push on past Umanska and capture the Karlovka reservoir. It is a body of water to the west of Umanska, and perhaps push on further still towards places like Pokrovsk, whether they intend to make that kind of advance, or whether, now that Berdichi has been taken and Pervomaisky has almost been taken, whether the objective of the Russians will be to advance north up the railway which lies to the east of Berdichi and Stepovye, area of intense fighting last year, that the Russians intend to advance up this railway towards the two villages of Novobakhmutovka and Ocheretinye, Ocheretinye being on high ground apparently, and being, as indeed the maps show, an important railway hub. So anyway, lots of fighting going on in the Avdiivka area. But let me return firstly to the fighting in Pervomaisky. As I said, the Russians now seem to be very close to capturing Pervomaisky. The Ukrainians made an attempt to cling on to Pervomaisky, which I have to say seems to me to have been unwise. And there were reports, which I think I touched on some days ago in a program, that the Ukrainians had counterattacked towards Nivolskoy, that the village to the south of Pervomaisky, that they might have actually recaptured that village. There are some claims to that effect again this morning. There's no visual corroboration that I have seen of this. I just thought that if the Ukrainians had indeed recaptured that village, we would have had some photographic evidence from Ukraine that that was the case. Perhaps the Ukrainians have re-entered Nivolskoy in some places. I don't know. But whatever. With Pervomaisky falling, it seems to me that the Ukrainian positions in Nivolskoy would, if they exist at all, are going to become untenable. And at that point, with the Russians now in a position to attacking Krasnogorovka from the east, and despite some claims, still located in the south of Krasnogorovka, the Russians are very close, it seems to me, to being in a position to take Krasnogorovka in a ring and to break Ukrainian resistance there. I think that is now only a matter of a relatively short amount of time. Probably we're going to see a sustained battle in Krasnogorovka, which is being heavily shelled and bombed by the Russians at some point over the next few weeks. And it's likely that with the Battle of Pervomaisky now coming to an end, the main focus of attention will now be on the fight for Krasnogorovka and for Chasiv Yar. That doesn't mean that these are the only places where fighting is going on. I talked about the claims the Ukrainians have made about their success in Terny on the Zherebets River. Perhaps more important than what is happening there, and clearly now the main focus of the Russian effort, is the Siversk direction, at least in the northern parts of the battlefronts. Lots of claims about lots of fighting going on in Siversk, or at least the area around Siversk, that the Russians continued their efforts to capture Belogorovka, that they're said to be slowly outflanking Belogorovka. And, well, they also seem to be advancing towards Siversk from the south, lots of reports that they are now bombing or seeking to attack or rather to capture this railway line. There's some reports that they're making progress along the railways, that the Russians are advancing along the railways and are close to doing so. There's also reports that the Russians have now begun bombing Serebryanka, which is the next village west of Velogorovka, which the Russians will presumably want to capture before they advance on Siversk itself from Velogorovka. But it does start to look as if there is some kind of sustained advance from the south and from the east towards Siversk, two pincers gradually closing in on this important town. Now, I will say, again, to repeat, we're getting a lot more information about what's going on in Chasiv Yar. If you go to Russian telegram channels like Slavyangrad, for example, or you listen to Dima at the Military Summary channel, or you read Reba and War Gonzo and all of these other people, the focus of much of their discussion and commentary now is the battle in Chasiv Yar, though they still talk quite a lot about Avdiivka, the Avdiivka area. So we get fewer reports about what's going on around Siversk, but maybe, quite plausibly, some kind of major offensive by the Russians is indeed taking place there. And last but not least, fighting still going on around Novomikhailivka. The Russians steadily now advancing on what's left of the Ukrainian positions there. I understand that most of the village is indeed under Russian control. When I say most of the village, perhaps I should say the whole of the village. What remains to be captured are some outlying buildings to the west. At least that's my understanding. If people want to push back on that, they're free to. But anyway, the Ukrainians reinforced Novomikhailivka. As I said, it seems to me a foolish thing to have done, but anyway, that is what they did. The Russians now steadily shelling and bombing Ukrainian positions in Paraskovyevka, which is the village immediately to the west, also bombing and shelling Konstantinovka, a rather larger village, also to the west, and also now heavily bombing Vuhledar, the main fortified position to the south. I think that the main attack on Vuhledar will eventually come, but I suspect we're still some weeks away from that. I think firstly the Russians will want to sort out Krasnogorovka once they're finished with Pervomaisky, and perhaps Chasiv Yar as well. And perhaps once these places have been taken, that's when the real battles for Siversk and Vuhledar and Kurakhovo will start in earnest. Anyway, that's my summary of the situation on the front lines. Clearly the Russians continuing to advance, clearly the Ukrainians being pushed back. Even Syrskyi admits this, and the situation for the Ukrainians becoming more difficult all the time. Now, I've had some very interesting reports from a number of sources, one in particular. And again, I have to be very careful in what I say, not to discuss information which might reveal who these sources are. The first thing I'm going to say is I've had some information about the general shell situation, and ultimately it centers on President Pavel's plan to try to buy artillery shells in the international arms market. And I've had some claims, I've had, in fact, a detailed report about where some of these shells might be coming from. And it's been suggested that some of them have been sourced from Saudi Arabia, some from direct Saudi stockpiles. Apparently, the Saudis have been importing shells from India. They have been re-exporting them to Czechs. The Czechs, in return, have agreed to provide the Saudis with licenses to build in Saudi Arabia some types of artillery, Czech-designed artillery. There's reports, this source says that the Czechs are also sourcing artillery shells from Pakistan. This, I believe, by the way, I've no doubt about it, in fact. I'm sure, I've long suspected that Pakistan is quietly providing shells to Ukraine. I'm also told that it's providing shells to Israel as well, by the way. There we go. I don't know whether that is true. But anyway, that Pakistan is now supplying shells to Ukraine. I think that is highly likely, apparently, again, via the Czechs. The shells, not perhaps always in especially good condition, but there we are. And, well, there are other places that shells perhaps are being procured from by the Czechs. I'm not going to go into details about that because I fear that if I do, I'm going to say more about the source. Anyway, the source says that the Ukrainians are getting more shells than I or others have been suspecting. He's given a figure for it. Again, I'm not going to give the figure because if I do, I worry once again that this is going to tell information about who this source is. All I would say is that the amount still disastrously inadequate as far as I can see for Ukrainian needs. And this source also suggests that beyond problems with shells, the even greater problem, in fact, perhaps the real problem that Ukraine is facing is shortage of artillery pieces, in other words, guns, that the Russians have been systematically destroying Ukraine's guns. And in fact, we got just one sample example of this from the Russian Defense Ministry bulletin that I was talking about. The report, this morning's report, yesterday's report rather, spoke about Russian counter-battery fire in the Avdiivka area. It said that it had destroyed, that the Russians destroyed just in this one area near Avdiivka. I believe actually that this is to the west of Umanskoye, and where the fighting is currently going on. That the Russians destroyed one M777 howitzer, one M109 Paladin self-propelled gun, one 122mm Gvozdika self-propelled gun. This is a legacy vehicle from the Soviet Union, and one D-30 howitzer. That was just in one part of the battlefronts that the Russians are proving very successful, in other words, in destroying Ukrainian artillery and in the area of Avdiivka. And then the Russians also claim that they've destroyed in the Zaporozhye and Kherson region. Again, this was just over the course of one day. One French-made Caesar self-propelled howitzer, another M777 howitzer, and two 122mm D-30 howitzers. These again Soviet last of two Soviet legacy howitzers that Ukraine still has. So it is indeed the case that the Ukrainians are losing artillery pieces at an accelerating speed. And of course, there's also been lots and lots of reports that the guns, the condition of the barrels of many Ukrainian artillery pieces is now critical, that the barrels have become worn out. So I am fully prepared to accept that the Ukrainian problems are probably as much about artillery pieces as they are about shells. But even on the basis of the figures that this source is providing me with, it's still clear to me that the Ukrainians are severely outmatched with shells. And this source gave another figure, and this figure I am going to give because it's been widely cited. It essentially says, the figure is that next year the Western powers will be able to increase their shell deliveries to Ukraine to around 120,000 rounds a month from the current far lesser total that Ukraine is receiving at the present time. Now, that figure may sound impressive, but 120,000 rounds a month translates to around 4,000 rounds a day. Russia's current production of shells is said to be, at least according to the West, it's said to be 250,000 rounds a month. I believe that it is significantly more than that. And Shoigu, of course, has also been visiting factories, and it is quite clear the production in Russia of shells is set to grow further over the course of this year. So, one way or the other, it still seems to me as if the Ukrainians are going to be massively outmatched in shells by the Russians throughout 2025, assuming we even get there. So I don't see these figures actually as a particular cause for optimism. It's perhaps worth pointing out that Ukraine did receive an awful lot of shells from the West in 2022 and 2023, taken out of existing stockpiles. The number of shells Ukraine is likely to receive over the course of 2025 on the basis of these figures is going to be significantly less than it received, for example, in 2022, and probably will match, but will probably be less than what it received over the course of 2023. And that's assuming all this new production comes on stream. I say that I've seen some reports that the new factory that the United States is trying to start, where they're trying to start new production of shells, there's some reports that the opening of that factory has been delayed. But again, I'm not going to get bogged down into a discussion of this. Anyway, let's put aside the question of artillery shells. As I said, these are the most optimistic numbers, both in terms of what Ukraine is receiving at present and what it is likely to receive next year. It doesn't seem to me that the situation is good. Russian production is growing. Ukraine might start to get more shells next year, but it's not going to be enough. Now, the other piece of information that I've received, again from a confidential source, and here I have to be particularly careful in not disclosing what this source is telling me, is about the Shoigu-Lecornu conversation that took place a few days ago. And again, this source is providing information that originates from discussions that are taking place in the Duma, in the Russian parliament. Russian parliamentarians and their aides are discussing these talks. Apparently, it's a hot topic of conversation. They're very well aware of what's happened. They don't have the full picture of exactly what passed between Lecornu and Shoigu, but certain general conclusions are apparently widely accepted within the Duma. And the first thing to say is that the call was definitely initiated from the French side, and there was some surprise that it was specifically addressed to Shoigu, that the French, seeking to make some kind of diplomatic outreach to the Russians, contacted the Russian Defense Ministry through the military attaches, presumably in Paris and Moscow, and sought to speak specifically with Shoigu rather than with some diplomatic representative from the foreign ministry. And that actually is an important fact in itself, and it deserves some thought. Anyway, Shoigu, when he learnt that the French wanted to speak with him, contacted Putin and got Putin's all clear to speak with the French. And apparently, and contrary to the complaints that have been coming from Macron, it was the French who set out to be threatening over the course of this call. Now, it seems that the cover story, that the call was principally about the Crocus City Hall attack that the French are putting out, is simply wrong. It was primarily, again, about French military deployments to Ukraine and about potential peace discussions, and specifically a freeze of the conflict. But anyway, what apparently is being said by people in the Duma is that Lecornu came across as somewhat aggressive, that he was basically telling the Russians, or at least Shoigu, that the Russians were going too far, that the situation that was playing out in Ukraine on the battlefronts was not one that the West could allow to continue, and that the Russians therefore needed to stop, or the Western powers, the implication was that the Western powers would intervene. And apparently Shoigu came away with two impressions from the talks. First, that the French were trying to test him personally to see his resolve and perhaps to try to create distance between Shoigu and Putin, and also perhaps to unnerve the Russians and to get the Russians to agree to some sort of conflict freeze with some kind of carte blanche thereby given, or green light given, from the Russians for some kind of French deployment, or rather NATO deployment, to Western Ukraine and specifically to the Odessa region. And Shoigu, of course, had been fully briefed by the Russian Foreign Ministry and had, of course, had a discussion with Putin before he engaged in this call, and he was unyielding. He said to the French that the Russians will target the French soldiers if they do enter Ukraine, that there is no possibility of any kind of freeze. If the French want to engage in a serious conversation about a potential settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, then the Russians are prepared to listen. The Istanbul Agreement, or draft agreement of April 2022, is the starting point for further future discussions, and that means the complete exclusion of NATO from every millimetre of Ukrainian territory. And apparently the conversation became extremely tense and went, shall we say, entirely contrary to what the French had been expecting. But anyway, or had been hoping. Anyway, perhaps what we are seeing here is growing signs of nervousness in the West, a sense that the situation is beginning to get out of control in Ukraine, that the Russian advance is now relentless, that, as Dima put it in his program yesterday, the Russian offensive looks like it is unstoppable, and the French and the other Western powers wringing their hands and trying to think what to do. There may have been an attempt to play Shoigu off against Putin. If so, it failed. There might have been a calculation that as a defense minister, Shoigu might not be up to speed on all the diplomatic niceties and might be intimidated by implied threats of NATO intervention in Ukraine. If that's the case, by the way, then it seems to me that a lack of understanding of Shoigu is remarkable, and a lack of awareness that as Shoigu is a permanent member of Russia's Security Council and is particularly close to Putin. Well, the whole idea that the West can play him off against Putin is an absurd one. But, who knows? Perhaps there are desperate people in the West who think that. But anyway, an unyielding position from the Russians. And the single most important thing that came out of the entire discussion was that Shoigu repeated and reiterated in the strongest terms, in the clearest terms, that if French troops or NATO troops entered Ukraine, they would be targets. They would be targets for Russian retaliation. The Russians would treat them as combatants the moment they arrived in Ukraine. So, the French went away. Macron was upset and shocked by the discussion. Presumably, it's back to the drawing board in the West. There's been talk about holding joint military exercises in Moldova, which is already dangerously close to Odessa. There are rumors that the Russians are now going to start bombing Odessa with their air force and their Fab glide bombs, which is an interesting possibility. Apparently, the air defenses around Odessa have been all but destroyed. Anyway, it could be a race for Odessa. I think that the Russians are probably saying to themselves that if they hold their nerve, which of course they will, the Western powers will ultimately back down. The Russians are fully aware of the state of NATO militaries. They're fully aware of the unwillingness of the United States to get drawn into a conflict in Ukraine, at this time a direct conflict with Russia. I think the the Russians are saying to themselves that the thing to do is to carry on with the military operation, remind the Western powers that if they do want to negotiate, it's for them to come up with concrete proposals that the Russians can work with, but the idea that the Russians are going to stop simply because the West wants them to, the idea that the Russians will agree to a conflict freeze because the West wants them to, the idea that the Russians are going to be scared by talk of Western deployments to Ukraine, all of that, the Russians have now made clear to the Western powers it's not going to happen. So there we go. That was, I think, a very interesting and useful clarification of what almost certainly happened over the course of this call. We see how nervous in some ways the Western powers are becoming, how they find themselves in a situation where they're now facing increasingly dangerous options, even at a time when NATO militaries are really not in any kind of position to engage in military adventures in Ukraine against the Russians, a nuclear superpower, and at a time when Western publics, as Edward Luttwak, who now advocates military deployments in Ukraine, is now grudgingly admitting. This is a disastrous idea. There is no way that the Russians are going to be bullied or frightened or seduced into agreeing to Western deployments in Ukraine. The idea that the Russians will sit back and let the West carve up Western Ukraine between them, and that German and British and French troops will be allowed to enter into Ukraine and will not be attacked, is absurd. I don't know where Western leaders get these ideas. I don't know what advice they're getting from their aides, but it's good, at least, that the Russians apparently have made the total unreality of these ideas clear, and one does hope that these warnings, this time, are being heeded. Now, the other big diplomatic news today is that apparently tomorrow Sergei Lavrov is heading to Beijing, and it's a reasonable guess that he's going to Beijing in advance of a visit to Beijing by his boss, Vladimir Putin. So it's likely that over the course of the next few days, we will have an announcement of a forthcoming trip, probably with a massive delegation behind him, of Putin to Beijing. Now, yesterday, I discussed Janet Yellen's and Joe Biden's threats to China, that if China continues to provide support to Russia, undermining Western sanctions, then the Western powers might start taking retaliatory action against Chinese companies and businesses. And I pointed out how Global Times pointedly reminded the Americans in a long article that, in fact, it's the Chinese who are actually in the stronger position. The United States may need help from China with its debt, which is the US might need US help from China with its debt. US debt is getting dangerously out of control. That as far as China is concerned, their relationship with Russia is not up for discussion or for negotiation. There are further commentaries in the Chinese media today making it very clear that despite some emollient language coming from Yellen, and apparently despite the fact that the Chinese have noticed that she's become quite deft, apparently, in using chopsticks, the Chinese simply do not trust the United States. There's even a long editorial about that in Global Times today. But the key passage is the one that I discussed yesterday, in which the Chinese say, in Global Times, or at least Global Times says, that everyone knows that with the United States trapped in Ukraine and Gaza in the Middle East, the United States is in no position to start anything with China with respect to Taiwan or in the South China Sea, Taiwan being an area where Xi Jinping, in his latest telephone call with Biden, the one that Biden initiated, Xi Jinping made it clear that Taiwan for China is the first red line which must not be crossed, and that if it is crossed, China will not sit on its hands. So, the point is that the Chinese feel themselves to be in a very strong position. Now, there has been an absolutely brilliant article, and a very necessary article, by Professor Jeffrey Sachs on his own blog about the state of the Chinese economy. And Professor Sachs, who is, of course, an international economist, somebody who's extremely expert in these areas, and, by the way, someone who we are honored on the Duran to have as a regular guest, he writes about the state of the Chinese economy in an informed way. And he makes a point which I, who am not an economist or an expert on the Chinese economy, have often wondered about, which is why we continue to read all these articles in the Western media that the Chinese economy is in some kind of crisis, when, on the contrary, it continues to grow and grow fast. Growth of over 5%, which is what China achieved last year, and which it is almost certain to achieve this year, is by any objective measure extremely rapid growth. And Professor Sachs made the further point that yes, there are some cyclical problems within the Chinese economy. There's been a property bubble. There's stresses in the banking system. This is hardly unique to China. The West, in very recent memory, has had problems with property bubbles and problems in its financial system. China, with its massive savings and extremely deep pockets, is in a far better position to handle those kind of problems than the West was when they struck. And in fact, all the indications are that the problem of the Chinese property bubble has to a great extent passed already. Just saying. The productive side of the Chinese economy continues to expand and grow. And Professor Sachs also makes some very interesting points about the direction of Chinese economic policy. He says that the Chinese would be most unwise to listen to all the advice that they're getting from people in the West, that what China needs to do is to emphasize consumption over investment, expand consumption. That would quickly lead to budget and perhaps trade deficits, and would actually slow growth. It is, in fact, what seems to me very much resembles the advice that all sorts of knowledgeable people were giving to Japan in the 1980s. And it didn't turn out so well for Japan. And anyway, Professor Sachs doesn't think it would turn out so well for China either. And anyway, Professor Sachs says that China would be well advised to stick to its current investment-led model, continuing to update its manufacturing, continuing to produce new high-tech industries, which is precisely what China is doing. The fact that the United States is trying to restrict development of these high-tech industries is an important indicator in itself that China ought to continue to focus on doing precisely those things. And Professor Sachs suggests that the right way for China to proceed is to accept that trade with the Western powers is likely to be increasingly restricted from now on, and to focus instead on developing its global relations with other countries, the many other countries that there are around the world, the global majority, and that this would be advantageous to them, and it would be advantageous to China too. Now, David Goldman, whose article in Asia Times discussing this security conference that top American security officials have recently held, in which they took, again, an extremely belligerent line on the conflict in Ukraine. Anyway, he says that the Chinese trade with the global majority countries outside the West is indeed surging, and now turnover there is roughly double what it was. Rather, Chinese exports there are now double what they were to the United States. I don't pretend to be an expert on this field, but it looks as if, from what David Goldman says, that the Chinese are doing exactly what Professor Sachs says they should do. So there's no crisis in the Chinese economy. The Chinese are adjusting their economy to the headwinds, part of which are the trade restrictions that have been imposed on them by the United States. The Chinese have dealt with their property bubble quite effectively. The Chinese economy continues to grow. Chinese living standards continue to increase. But to come back to those articles in Global Times, there's another one, by the way, today, which makes the same point about the United States being trapped in Ukraine and Gaza. Observations, by the way, I ought to say, which were previously made by Professor Mearsheimer. These articles show that the Chinese have come to exactly that conclusion. It seems to me that if one follows the logic and looks at this from a Chinese perspective, with their economy strong, as Professor Sachs says, and growing, with living standards in China rising, it's actually in China's interest that the United States continue to be distracted and tied down in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And that actually logically means that it makes sense for China to promote and support Russia in Ukraine, because doing that traps or bogs down the Americans. It's in fact very easy to see how this whole project has turned out having exactly the opposite effect to the one that its progenitors in Washington, people like Wes Mitchell, for example, and others, imagined that it would. It's put China in a stronger position relative to the United States rather than a weaker one. Just saying. So, anyway, all of this leads up to the fact that the Western powers are not going to be able to knock China-Russia relations off course. On the contrary, Lavrov is likely to receive a friendly reception in Beijing, and Lavrov's boss, Putin, is going to receive an even friendlier one when, as I expect, he arrives there at some point in the next few weeks or months. Now, I'm going to round up this program by just making a number of further observations. I've been very, very puzzled by this narrative about that's been circulating in the West about the potential effect on the oil market of Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries. I'm not going to revisit that whole topic again, but as I said, neither the economics nor the actual realities make much sense to me. Well, we might have had a clue now, because the United States has apparently again insisted that Ukraine stop these attacks on the refineries. And there are reports this morning that Ukraine very grudgingly has agreed to do so. The clue might be provided by a report that I saw this morning that the United States is saying, firstly, that it does not want to see Russian oil supplies to India and China reduce. It understands that these supplies are essential to keeping the oil market balanced and to preventing an explosion in the price of oil, which the Biden administration, especially in an election year, absolutely does not want to see, because it realizes that it is politically toxic in the United States. But there is something even more remarkable. This is that the United States is apparently saying that the moment crude oil is refined, Russian crude oil is refined, it ceases to be Russian. And the import restrictions that the Western powers have imposed on imports of Russian oil at that point cease to apply. So, I am going to make a guess that quietly the United States and perhaps other Western countries have been increasing their imports, but especially the United States, have been increasing their imports of refined oil products from Russia. They can't import crude oil from Russia because they've sanctioned that. But they are importing diesel and petrol. Probably it's coming through third parties. India, I suspect, probably playing a major role in this trade. The pretense is that it is being refined in India for re-export to the West, but I suspect that deep down the United States knows that in reality much of this oil is being refined in Russia itself, and because of the sensitive nature of this issue, but also because of the importance of maintaining a stable price in the market, the international market for petroleum products, the United States, especially in an election year, has decided to look the other way. So I think this is the clue, the key to this mystery. What the United States absolutely does not want to see is a reduction in the flow of refined oils, petrol and diesel, and perhaps, who knows, even aviation fuel, to the international market. And Ukrainian attacks on refineries, even when they are in Russia, is therefore deeply unwelcome. That tells us the knots the United States has tied itself into with its sanctions war. It is only one of many paradoxes. With the price of oil anyway elevated, the Russians must be making a killing. Anyway, there we are. That is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me say again that you can find all my programs, all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can buy all sorts of amazing things, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, other wonderful things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.